Today, I'd like to talk to you about standards. Most of you probably have read standards, but you don't know how they're made. And part of the idea is to encourage you to actually use what you're producing in standards and try and contribute to them. And I'll try and persuade you what the benefits are. There aren't a great deal of benefits, but you can look at my travel map a bit later. So a little bit of background about me. I'm incredibly ancient. My first crypto equipment was in 1979 for satellite encryption. I then wrote all sorts of rubbish like BS 7799 that became ISO 27001, which I've still charged £60 to read what I wrote. Admittedly, it's changed quite a bit, but I feel that one hurts a bit. I then did a lot of stuff on public key, and I'll explain that a little bit, just using that as an example of how it turned into standard. I then turned on to GSM, and my working career, I was 20 years in British Telecom. I'm an engineer, for which I apologise, but I really enjoy it. I spent 20 years in BT. I then spent 4 years having fun in a mobile phone operator, running security there. And then I went on and took early retirement as a civil servant for 12 and a half years, and I retired 8 years ago. So I've been involved in industry for many, many years. And at the moment, I chair the ETSI cybersecurity group. For the last 4 years. It's an act of penance because I helped set it up, so I thought I ought to chair it. Don't ask me to define cybersecurity. We don't even know how to spell it. So why do we have standards, right? I'm trying to make this quite amusing. I don't apologise for my style. I'd like to start off with the second law of thermodynamics, which all of you know is about entropy. And in fact, the standards community is a great sense of entropy going on at the moment. Okay, so what we're really trying to do is to put things to the right, to try and create an organized infrastructure. That doesn't always work, but sometimes it does, and we sometimes get some great products and services out of it. But there's so many different competing organizations working on standards that we are really fighting a war against entropy on standards. But it's a nice concept for you to illustrate why we're actually creating standards. So it's purely a random chance that we end up with a decent standard as well. So what are standards? Well, of course, the marking of ships, as you all well know, goes back to the Cretan Roman times. The Venetians and the Genoans actually had proper marks on the side of their vessels. That was brought in by a civil... actually, he wasn't. He was a member of Parliament called Samuel Plimsoll in the 1850s. And it's now all done by international convention on how you load ships. So that's a wonderful example of a standard. So TF is tropical fresh water, for example. F is a freshwater standard on the left. So that's where you actually load the ships to, and all sorts of stuff like that. And there's really interesting things like Western Atlantic winter settings for your ships and stuff like that. So you know how to load the ships. That's an example of a standard that goes back a couple of thousand years and is still maintained by convention. And still works. So they've been around an awful long time. There's all sorts of other stuff. That's the CE mark. That one's with the exclamation mark is to make sure that it actually, it used to be called the RTTE Directive. I'll get on to what it's called now, the Radio Equipment Directive. But that makes sure that what you're doing doesn't actually fry your brains or anything like that. It's quite an important standard. The exclamation mark is a radio one. It is forged quite a bit, so there is a standard called the China Export Standard, which is also looks extremely similar. So you can be taken in quite a bit. Many other standards. You know, you look at these large ships and wonder why containers fit on each other. Well, that's an interesting standard there. You could tell that happens. So I just want to, and you know, everything's tested from standards, from lead toys, lead paint in child's toys and everything. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how I got involved in making standards, just to illustrate how you can get involved. I must admit it hasn't been a particularly profitable enterprise for me. I failed to patent anything. That's probably why I'm still here trying to scrape a living. And actually, no, I'm not scraping a living, really. I'm just letting my wife have a bit of peace and quiet at home. So that's the main purpose I'm here. So public key cryptography. Crypto 84, I actually gave a talk and I produced some public key equipment. Everybody said it would never work. They were probably right. I went on and produced I've got some illustrations of the equipment. I don't actually have it at home. It was rather heavy. It's all been sadly destroyed. We did produce a lot of public key equipment, hardware chips in BT in the early 80s. Obviously, it was fairly novel at the time. We went on and then wrote the X400 message handling system that then got on and taken on to X509. X509, all the public key certificates that you're familiar with were all derived from that bit of work. Why did we do it? Well, we thought it was quite interesting. I was in BT Labs and having a nice play with lots of bit of equipment. How did it become a standard? Well, I quite fancied a bit of travel. We took on Professor Roger Needham from Cambridge, God rest his soul, who was retained by Xerox to have a secret key system. We hadn't heard of quantum computers at that time. We thought public key fitted rather well. So we had a big standards meeting in the middle of a frozen Ottawa in 1986, and we won. And so public key cryptography happened. So that's how it happened. It was us producing little bits of equipment like that. That was our 256-bit 1983 parallel discrete integrated circuit with a desencryptor on the top. Those are the chips we made. So we actually made various hardware. In the days, they were all handcrafted, so I could put little pictures of the BT logo on the chips. It was much more fun than this automated stuff. You can't put nice little pictures in. But that's a lot of our hardware. We have 256-bit parallel cascadable RSA, because we were really aiming at 512 for a lot of that. And we've had some of our crypto chips as well, bcrypt, and satellite encryption chip from 1979 as well, called TACA. So we were involved in all of that. And actually what we were doing wasn't quite so different to what things like public key finally ended up as. We actually had cards, smart cards. Actually, they were just memory cards, but they worked pretty well together with a pin. With a secret key on, and we also actually used a EEPROM data key as well. And we actually shrunk the equipment down. There it is with the EEPROM data key and stuff like that. So that's how that actually became a standard. And, you know, it's quite nice to think back and all of a sudden think, well, you know, I actually think it's quite nice because in 10 years' time, perhaps public key cryptography will be dead anyhow. So it's nice to see it come in and disappear due to thanks to quantum computers. But that's another issue. But this is a really good example, one of the examples I'm going to give you, of how you can actually get involved using your work that you're doing and then going to standards meetings. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'd just like to give another example that I was... So back in the mid-80s, we were dreaming up GSM. I'd been involved in the security of analog phone systems before that. I knew they were a total load of rubbish. For example, one of our systems with 60,000 users, only 20,000 were paying the bill. I did actually get told by people that security wasn't an issue. And when we designed GSM, it was really quite scary how people thought it was totally irrelevant, all the bits that we were doing for security. We designed an A5 algorithm that was supposed to be 42 bits because that was all we could export under Qualcomm regulations. I was quite amused when people started saying security through obscurity on A5. I knew it was 42 bits, so I wasn't going to publish it. And it did take 20 years. I was told it would have to last for 20 years, and it did. My guarantees, as you can see, expired in 2006. So anybody who continued using it after that, I'm afraid we actually designed GSM as well to have no overhead. So we had that very simple encryption algorithm with shift registers for A5. We wanted to implement it in hardware as well. We actually made it upgradable, so it can actually handle up to 8 different algorithms in. We're up to A54 at the moment, which is okay-ish. We were told it would have to have minimum impact, all the usual things people tell you. It's got to work in about 2 microseconds. It's got to have minimal impact on the hardware. We did consider all sorts of things like public key. As you can see, I had experience in public key, but of course it was impossible to put public key in. And I've heard the same sort of arguments today about it's not lightweight, the processing power isn't available. That was even true back in 1986 when I chaired the algorithm expert group. And unfortunately, because of all these pressures, we missed out all sorts of things. So I still have my original documents where I proposed a free way to actually authenticate the network. But sadly, GSM, they said, oh no, can't do that, take too much time. So now, of course, you have all the false base station attack scenarios, which have been going on for years. People will have never learned, do they? I mean, I was told, and I disbelieved it at the time, that the infrastructure would be far too expensive for somebody to clone, and really they don't understand what security is about, practical security. So, I was involved in that. I chaired the algorithm expert group, and I was doing a lot of research, and in fact we got everything firmed up by 1988 on it, about what the GSM challenge response structure was. And of course, people have used that for all sorts of stupid schemes afterwards without understanding that GSM was actually designed for one particular purpose. People actually miss out the fact that you're designing something to work in a practical business situation. So I've seen the challenge responses produced for Wi-Fi. I mean, what's the point of that, honestly? It just doesn't work. So just to explain why GSM was designed like that, well, in the old days, when it was first designed, operators weren't allowed to sell mobile phones. They had to be sold through third parties. So we actually included the SIM card for that reason, in that the operator wanted to authenticate the end user, so that was effectively their token. It would go into any phone. And we also included it because you couldn't actually trust a manufacturer to make a mobile phone securely. And it had to be upgradable. Of course, I'll come on to eSIMs a little bit later, but I'm old-fashioned enough to think that argument still continues, and how you upgrade an IoT device that's going to last for 15 to 20 years is an interesting challenge. GSM, and I spent an awful lot of time involved in GSM since I considered it to be my fault, together with my committee. So I went on to SMG10 and then 3GPP and long, tedious meetings. And I'll talk about the standards making process later. So that's effectively what we came up with, and it's all very familiar. That's from a paper back in 1992. Challenge response and GSM. Okay, so how do you actually get involved in standards? Well, basically there are hundreds of standards bodies, and I'll go on to that in a moment, but you just turn up. In some cases you have to pay. There's national standards bodies, so BSI in the UK, DIN in Germany, AFNOR in France. You can turn up to any of those. they all feed into other bodies. In Europe, there are 3 bodies that are allowed by the European Commission to create standards in a legal sense. We have to react to EN's European norms. And so any mandate we produce a standard for. Those are ETSI, CEN and CENELEC, and they cover the whole spectrum from lead paint and toys to ETSI does the telecoms bits, although. And then there's also treaty organisations like ITU-T that create standards, ITU Telecoms. So if you really want good trips to Geneva, I find rather expensive and boring, you can go and argue with the rest of the world there, or ISO and all sorts of, and there are many others. And there's lots and lots of industry bodies as well. So we've already had about W3C, the GSM Association, which is the worldwide organisation of operators. I chaired their security group for 25 years, so I've seen it all. Finally, I got rid of it. So if you wanted to join ETSI, it's €2,000, and it's a really nice place to the south of France. I'll have a small advertisement on that a bit later. And if you double your subscription, you can go to 3GPP meetings if you really get keen. You can write 3rd generation mobile and 5G standards. I'm not wearing my 5G badge today in case I get shouted down or somebody asks me what it is. I know we published the standards, but a bit of a heresy. We still don't really know what it is, and nobody does at the moment. Well, it does offer lots of interesting things. Or ETSI actually runs things called ISGs that you don't even have to be a member of. You can just turn up and go to the meetings. And for example, we had a quantum computing ISG producing quantum safe algorithms. I'll talk about that later. So, you know, it's not too bad. You just turn up. So there's all sorts of standards. I'm not expecting you to read that. I can't read it in front of me here, but there's a whole raft of standards we can produce from the ENs, as I said, which is European norms that actually have a legal impact. People actually have to do that because the Commission says they do, to things like ETSI guides and TSs, which are the real standards, and technical reports. So there's all sorts of stuff you can do. So how do you make standards? Well, you sit in a darkened room for days on end, rather like this one. No clocks, no daylight, hundreds of you sitting down. It's usually somewhere nice, but you don't know where you are until you look in the hotel room because they all look the same, and you might have a Buddhist tract and you think, oh yes, I'm in the Far East today, or a Book of Mormon and you're probably in Utah. But you never get to see anywhere. Literally, we work at 8 in the morning till about midnight, if not longer, producing all this stuff. And some people actually use it. I mean, for example, GSM, 3G has been a great success because it allows people to mix and match infrastructure. It's competitive. It allows, I mean, in the old days with the analog mobile phone systems, you either Ericsson or Motorola, for example. Now you can buy your equipment and have competitive tendering. So it's good for operators. It's good for manufacturers because all their equipment sort of interworks, although there's usually a whole lot of mistakes involved, but it does work. How do you write a standard? Well, there are very few idiots who actually write the standards. So you just say, I want to become an author. And everybody will gladly say, oh yes, you're an author, you write the standard. And then you write them. Now other people will contribute, but normally people aren't too keen, so you just go away and write it. And that's it. That's the standards making process. So if you have something that you have been doing some research in that you think might be useful, like public key or GSM type of structure, then you can make a standard with it. It's absolutely no problem at all. Except you do sort of feel rather disconnected from the world, and that's a typical standards meeting. I mean, occasionally something fun happens, like at one of our meetings, the Dell battery caught fire that we then put on YouTube, and Dell had to recall all their computers. But you know, there's actually not much fun in making standards. But well, there are some fun parts. I mean. We always put silly things in standards. So 3G authentication algorithm, millinage, who's heard of that? Marvellous, a few people, yeah, that's a splendid bottle of French wine we had. That's why it's called millinage. CHUAC is a little more difficult, the one for 4G. You have to speak Malay to understand that that's palm oil alcohol. Only one lunatic could have thought that one up. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, and we put jokes in the standards, but not many people read them, thank goodness. Or not many people find them, even better. That's only my British Airways travel map, which I downloaded. I've been to lots of other places as well, but other more dodgy airlines and EasyJet and things like that. But even BA says I've been to 68 countries, I think. I mean, there's Australia and New Zealand and all sorts of other places that weren't included because I didn't go there. So I like to think of standards as technical tourism. But I would like to warn you against the fact that it doesn't actually broaden the mind because you never know where you are anyhow. So. But you are awfully familiar with many airport lounges around the world. Okay, so yeah. So it's not complicated making standards. But there's too many standards. We actually produce an ETSI guide, which is free to download from the ETSI site. And that almost gives the European infrastructure. Well, no, that's the worldwide one with standards makings. You can recognize people like IETF and OASIS. I know I put ETSI in the center of the universe because, you know, I mean, Copernicus got it right, but, you know, this is an ETSI document, so I put it there. But there's lots of other people making standards, and the result is that there's a lot of rival standards, and sometimes they're not even standards, really, and industry standard making, but you've got NIST and Department of Homeland Security. And even if you get to Europe, you'd have hoped that everything would be wonderful, but it isn't. There's a lot of people making standards in Europe. So, as has been said before, if you have trouble sleeping at nights, do read TR 103 306. That gives at least an overview. We try and keep up to date of all the standards making bodies, even within Europe. As you can see, ETSI, who, interestingly enough, it's their 30th anniversary today, 29th of March. I remember when it started, so. Have all sorts of people involved, TC Cyber, and then we have all sorts of things like lawful interception. We have the algorithm group under SAGE and NFV, network function virtualization. So the sky's your limit if you really want to get involved in these things. Another thing that drives standards is legislation. Recently, I've spent a lot of time on the Eurostar to Brussels in the United Kingdom, talking about their various directives. I'm still trying to understand what they actually mean for us technically, but we do try and produce guides, and they force us to produce these ENs, European norms, in response to them. So we have GDPR, of course. None of us really know what that is because apparently, according to people in the Commission, they're not going to tell us until actually in May when they brought the law in, because they can't actually legally tell us what we're supposed to be doing. So that's wonderful. Catch-22. The NIS Directive, which basically tells you that you've got to warn everybody. The Cyber Security Directive, which is all about product marking. I went to a meeting on that last week, and they were still asking for suggestions on that. The Radio Equipment Directive, which is quite fun, and the mobile. So basically, you probably hear me as being a bit dismissive about legislation. The trouble with the legislation, it's written by lawyers, and it doesn't tell you what you have to do technically at all, and they don't have an understanding of what you want to do anyhow. Sadly, to my cost, I've been involved in legislation. I mean, I was involved in back to the Computer Misuse Act and things like that, 1990. That was in response to the Prestel hacking, but most of you haven't heard of Prestel, which is good. So this is an example of the Mobile Phone Reprogramming Act 2002, which is an act on the statute book in the United Kingdom. by the Lords spiritual and temporal, if you read it. What's quite amusing about UK acts, for example, is that what it's called and what it's the title headings have no legal significance at all. So the Mobile Phone Reprogramming Act actually tells you that you commit a serious criminal offence, that's 5 years in jail, if you change a unique identifier in a wireless telecommunications device. Well, that's a load of nonsense, isn't it? Because that means I'm 5 years in jail if I reprogram my garage door, let alone change the MAC address of my card or something like that. So, I mean, that's an example of a law that's been written which is complete nonsense, and there's many examples of that. I mentioned the Radio Equipment Directive. Well, that's all due to, I noticed somebody had an illustration of, this is the princess version of Kayla, by the way, which you should not take into Germany, because it's banned in Germany, because it uploads. I keep mine privately at home for weekends, but sorry. But Princess Kayla sends all the data back to Nuance, and it's spying on, and it's the usual IoT thing, totally insecure. So that actually then means a Radio Equipment Directive, which is the CE mark, the successor to the RMTTE directive, actually now has a clause to do with privacy and security in. We're all writing in saying this is a load of nonsense, but it actually means that any system that has an embedded wireless system will have to have privacy and security in. So that's your washing machine and things. I suppose it's sensible, but then you're trying to obey the GDPR and everything else. And is that really a realistic objective to something like an IoT device that you're making for sense? And so, I mean, I like to get, that's my bear, by the way, who always gets a pass card to the Mobile World Congress every year, because I like to try and break the system. Basically, it's bribery of the past staff, because they know me. So out of 120,000 people, he's the only person who gets a pass card. This year was particularly difficult because they insisted on passports, so I had to bribe some Spanish people to say that he had a passport as well. Okay, right. So some of the illustration work that we're doing in ETSI, we produce ETSI guides on quantum safe computing. I'm not going to go over what that means, but it's something we have to tell the world, because people are still using public key and introducing it, and they have to be aware of at least being able to swap it out and changing it, let alone understanding what it means. So we produce an ETSI guide on quantum safe. They're going on to do things like quantum safe VPNs. They're actually producing stuff on that. So, I mean, there's the ETSI guide, you can download it, it gets updated. Embedded SIMs, eSIMs, I always find quite fun. We actually run a little company in Cambridge Science Park with 2 full-time employees doing some of this stuff for SIM provision and things. But basically it means that there will be electronic SIMs embedded in things. Now I go back to all my old discussions, because I'm very old and ancient, as to whether you can trust any hardware manufacturer to make a commercial piece of equipment that's secure anyhow. And these things are going to be embedded SIMs, are going to work in IoT devices with that long time scale. So sure as eggs is eggs, they'll be crap. So we'll all have jobs in the future. But anyhow, eSIM is a wonderful thing. And Qualcomm, of course, are producing the chipsets coming out real soon now. And there's 60 plus companies signed up for the eSIM initiative, including people like Infineon, but let's gloss over that. And there's Microsoft, the new Windows 10 with the new Qualcomm processor that'll have an embedded SIM in as well. So there we are. I leave it open as to whether people have thought well about security and whether it'll work nicely for all those years. So there's an awful lot of ETSI standards, European and international. That's what we're actually doing at the moment. Lawful interception is quite fun. There's all the 5G stuff. Qualcomm course, it does all wonderful things like network function virtualization, network slicing, so you can really have quality of service now on different slices, and latency, so your auto-driving vehicles won't crash into each other. But there's lots of challenges for it as well. It also offers much better privacy as well. But of course, that's counter to terrorists running around, so it's always an interesting dilemma. I think it comes down to which country you actually live in as to whether you trust people who are doing it or not. But that's also questionable too. I've actually, because I thought people might be interested in 3GPP, and this is in a slide pack, just told you what the architecture and security documents are you should be reading. Some of them are a bit draft, but if you want to understand 3G without working through 12 meters of paperwork, those are probably some useful documents to start for. In the unlikely event you get through this lot, you can find the 3GPP specs located in, and you can download them. So, I think it's also interesting on the back of standards to look at the fact that how does it work in real life? How do the standards work in real life? Well, if you take a mobile phone, you've heard about the Radio Equipment Directive, the RTTE Directive. Basically, we have an organization called the Global Certification Forum. So we actually write tests for all this equipment for interworking. And if it conforms with Global Certification Forum, the manufacturers self-declare. And there is a challenge system on that as well, so that if something doesn't conform to it, it can be challenged. And the 3GPP, that includes 5G of course, specs are actually written by people all around the world. So the China standards bodies, the Japanese, the Korean, the US, and they all adopt that particular global certification forum. So if you actually have something that's made in Europe or made in China or made in the US, it's accepted elsewhere. And actually this is quite good even from my security point of view. So for example, when I had power years ago, I could actually say that I'm going to remove A52 from all phones certified after a certain date, or I'm going to put A53. I said I'm going to put A53 in all mobiles after 2001, and that happened. So most mobiles of 2000 from 2001, after they were certified, all of them had A53 in. So it allows an upgrade path to stronger and stronger algorithms. So it's actually quite a useful body, and standards are used as barriers to trade. Sorry, I'm getting on rather philosophical area here. People create different standards. There's a lot of, for example, Chinese security standards for 3G, for Wi-Fi and so on. So barriers to trade are very particularly important. So to have structures like this means that you can actually freely import and export equipment around the world. And you have to change the export control laws. I mean, for example, export control, which includes Japanese, Russians, Europe, everybody else, come under the Wassenaar Agreement. So we actually changed Wassenaar, so it was legal to take an individual mobile phone with a strong algorithm outside. Indeed, all our algorithms now are put up for public scrutiny. We can actually do that now. And if it's strong, that doesn't matter because it's a publicly available algorithm you can buy over the counter. So there's a lot of politics behind what's going on here. Marvellous. Well, I shall move swiftly on. So yeah, those are some of the ETSI sites. As I say, even though I chair the Cybersecurity Committee, I have no idea what cybersecurity is or how to spell it. I've read about 20 different definitions, but it gives us money and work, so it must be good. And you can always email me if you have any questions on how to get involved in standards. We do have a really wonderful ETSI Security Week, which is free in June in the south of France. For some reason, it's nice and cheap to go to. EasyJet is cheap. It's quite attractive surroundings with free meals. So I always go there because I get I get persuaded to become chairman of various things. So I'm involved in that. I helped start it off in the beginning. So if you want to learn about standards, this is a good way. We're doing all sorts of stuff like distributed ledgers, IoT security, and all the standards making people get together and talk. And we have about 200 people. So thank you, everybody. And any questions, or can I escape? Yeah.
How do we make sure that there's quality assurance in the standards making process? Because I have seen some horrific drivel being standardized. If you Google telebiometrics, ITU, X1000, so there are things where actually output of psychiatric malfunctions of authors have been rubber stamped by ITU.
Well, the ITU is interesting, isn't it? Because many of the standards are written by people who don't have a broad experience, so who are there because they're funded by their universities and things to go. So, and they're actually rewarded on the basis of the number of standards they produce, which is probably the wrong key point to reward people on. So this is my own cynical view of standards making. Some standards won't work. Sometimes people make mistakes. I mean, the first 2 years of 3G authentication, two of the manufacturers got it inverted, so authentication didn't work. Fortunately, we managed to keep that quiet from people like you, so nobody was able to make money from it. And I also spend my life trying to stop people breaking systems. So I spend a lot of time randomizing different inputs and putting secret change requests into things. Some of them will be really bad. You have to choose on the basis of quality as to who you think you're going to go to. As I said, there's a vast number of groups. There's a lot of entropy there. Today, in fact, we've actually just put a disclosure scheme on the 3GPP web pages, which is a very draft one. But at least we're trying to do it. The GSM Association has started to do it, so people can do things with eSIM. And I think, that's a good way forward, is to work with a community of people who are trying to attack things. But how you get rid of rubbish standards, I don't know. I mean, it's like how do you get rid of rubbish patents? It's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah.
So roughly, what's the timeline between the moment where people agreed on something and the time where it's actually got out there? For technology standard, I guess it varies.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I would say it was about 4 to 5 years. So we've published the 5G standards in a sort of interesting form in November last year. But if you read the press, you'd believe that everybody was operating 5G this week and they'd been doing it for the last 2 years. So I mean, I find it quite fun how people operate technology before we've actually written the standards, and of course it's an idiot's game because they get left behind when the standards are finalised. But yes, I mean, it all comes down to market forces, quite honestly. Is there a business case for 5G? Well, I don't know whether there's a business case for 5G. I don't even know if there's a business case for 4G. I mean, people want it a bit faster, but who knows? I'm afraid people don't make things in the traditional way either. Sorry, this is just me. Where they understand what the business case is before they're doing it, and then the threat models. So if you look at the business case of 5G, it seems to cover just about everything. Yeah. So who knows? 5G may or may not succeed. I'm sure a lot of people will have 5G systems, but whether it conforms to standards is something else.
We've maybe got time for one more question.
Okay.
Yeah, quick one. How do you prevent? Well, it's impossible. So there are certainly interests, national interests when building up standards. So how are those mediated, and how do we prevent, particular interests to prevail over everybody else?
Well, sometimes you're not actually successful, but in theory there is a very strict voting structure. So you have to attend 3 standards meetings beforehand. You can. So you have to be established to vote. We have anonymous voting schemes. if it comes to a row. I mean, obviously, some things do come to a row, other things don't. So, but of course, there's people who can abuse the systems. Some of the SIM standards were particularly interesting, where one of the manufacturers bought lots and lots of votes by registering themselves in lots of different countries. So yes, there's a lot of politics that cause a lot of rows as a result of it. Normally the chairman has to be quite political, and I do play quite a political game in many of my standards. But normally you get, none of the standards are actually discussed really at the meetings. It's all decided in the bar or in the meeting room outside, so consensus works really well.